Grace had always considered herself a devoted wife. Married to Jonathan for over a decade, she had found a certain peace in the routine of their life together. They had built a comfortable home, raised two children, and were active members of the local church. On the surface, their relationship appeared stable, even ideal. But beneath the surface, there was a growing emptiness. Over the years, Grace had settled into a marriage that lacked the spark it once had. Jonathan, a man of few words and even fewer emotions, was often consumed by work. He was a good provider, reliable and kind, but affection and intimacy had long been absent. Their conversations were functional, revolving around household chores, finances, and the children. The passion, the connection had faded. Grace, who had once dreamed of love and deep connection, found herself suppressing those desires. She threw herself into her church duties, attending services every Sunday and volunteering whenever she could. The church became a place of refuge, a place where Grace felt needed, appreciated, and, more importantly, valued. It was here, in the sanctuary, where Grace began to feel something she hadn't in years, a stirring inside her. It wasn't just a spiritual connection, it was emotional, almost magnetic. At the center of it all was Pastor James, the charismatic leader of the congregation. He was a man in his mid-40s with a calming presence that commanded attention and respect. His sermons were inspiring, filled with compassion and wisdom that resonated deeply with Grace. She admired his leadership, his unwavering faith, and the way he spoke with such conviction about life and love. It was not long before Grace found herself drawn to him in ways she couldn't quite explain. Every Sunday, she attended the service with a sense of anticipation. It wasn't the message alone that captivated her, but the energy Pastor James radiated. His voice seemed to reach deep into her soul, touching parts of her that had been dormant for years. His words brought a clarity to her life, as if he understood her struggles without her needing to say a word. Grace couldn't deny that there was a part of her that felt alive when she was around him. She tried to push these feelings aside, telling herself that it was just admiration, nothing more. But as the weeks went by, she found herself lingering after the service, hoping for a chance to speak with him. Their conversations started small, comments on the sermon, brief exchanges about her family, but they soon grew deeper. Pastor James took the time to ask about her life, her family, her struggles. He listened intently, as though her words were important, and he offered thoughtful advice. It wasn't long before Grace began to look forward to these brief moments of connection. There was something in his gaze that made her feel seen, truly seen, in a way that Jonathan hadn't in years. She didn't want to admit it, but there was a growing sense of longing that she couldn't shake. She tried to justify it, telling herself that it was just a harmless connection, something that made her feel valued and appreciated. But deep down, she knew that her admiration for Pastor James was crossing a line. Her marriage to Jonathan was not a bad one, but it was lacking in the emotional intimacy Grace so desperately craved. Jonathan, for all his strengths, had never been able to give her what she needed emotionally. They rarely spoke about their feelings, their hopes, or their dreams. He was content with the quiet, functional nature of their marriage, but Grace was not. She wanted more. She wanted to feel cherished, desired, and understood. And in Pastor James, she began to see the kind of man who could offer her that, a man who spoke to her heart, not just her mind. Despite her growing feelings, Grace pushed them aside. She focused on her family, her faith, and her role in the church. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't escape the pull she felt toward Pastor James. It wasn't just his sermons that moved her. It was his kindness, his ability to connect with others on a level that felt deeply personal. She found herself thinking about him long after their conversations ended, replaying the moments in her mind, savoring the way he made her feel. Grace knew that she had to be careful. She was a devoted wife, after all, and infidelity was the furthest thing from her mind. She loved Jonathan, or at least she thought she did. But in Pastor James, she began to see a reflection of the man she had always longed for, a man who was emotionally present, who listened, who cared. She couldn't ignore the connection she felt, but at the same time, she felt immense guilt for even entertaining such thoughts. How could she, a woman of faith, allow herself to be drawn to another man? How could she betray the vows she had made to Jonathan? The guilt gnawed at her, but so did the yearning. Grace found herself caught between her loyalty to Jonathan and the intense emotional connection she felt with Pastor James. It was a quiet, subtle pull, but it was there, steadily growing stronger with each passing day. She wasn't sure where it would lead, but she knew one thing for certain: her life was changing, and she wasn't sure she could control it. Grace had tried to ignore the emotions swelling inside her, but the temptation was undeniable. It all came to a head one evening when Pastor James invited her to discuss a church project. It was supposed to be a simple conversation about the upcoming fundraiser, but as soon as Grace arrived at his office, she could feel the air shift. The door closed behind her, and she was alone with him, away from the watchful eyes of the congregation. There was no longer any pretense, no distractions. At first, they talked about the church event, logistics, plans, and ideas. But as the conversation continued, the tone changed. Pastor James seemed more relaxed, more open. He spoke to her not just as a church member, but as a person, a woman who had her own life and challenges. His words were soft and thoughtful, yet they carried a weight that Grace couldn't ignore. She had always admired his wisdom, but tonight, something was different. His gaze lingered a little longer than usual, and Grace couldn't help but notice how his eyes softened as he spoke to her. When the conversation shifted to more personal matters, Grace felt her heart race. Pastor James shared something vulnerable, a struggle he had been facing in his own life. He confided in her, speaking about the loneliness he often felt despite being surrounded by people. He spoke of the pressure of his position, the weight of being a pastor, and how, at times, he wished he could be understood in a way that went beyond his role as a leader. His words resonated with Grace, and she found herself opening up in return. She spoke of the emotional distance in her marriage, of the longing she had buried for so long. It was a moment of raw honesty, and in that space, Grace felt something she had never expected to feel: connection. The walls between them seemed to crumble, and she realized how deeply she had yearned for this kind of emotional exchange. For years, she had been holding back, keeping her emotions in check, never letting herself be truly vulnerable with anyone. But here, with Pastor James, there was a sense of comfort, an unspoken understanding that made her feel like she could finally exhale. Then it happened. Without warning, Pastor James leaned closer. His hand brushed hers gently, a simple touch that sent a jolt of electricity through her. She froze, unsure of what to do next. Her mind screamed at her to pull back, to end the conversation and leave, but her body betrayed her. She didn't pull away. In that moment, it felt like the world outside the room had disappeared. It was just the two of them, caught in a charged, silent space. And then, before she could fully process what was happening, Pastor James kissed her. It was soft at first, tentative, as if he, too, was unsure of what he was doing. But as their lips met, something inside Grace broke free. She had been suppressing this desire for so long, and in that moment, it all came rushing to the surface. She kissed him back, not thinking, not questioning. It was a kiss that seemed to speak volumes, about her loneliness, about her unmet needs, about the emotional distance that had been growing in her marriage. As soon as the kiss ended, Grace pulled back, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. The reality of what had just happened hit her like a tidal wave. She felt dizzy, disoriented, as guilt washed over her in an overwhelming tide. What had she done? She had crossed a line that she couldn't uncross. Pastor James looked at her, his expression filled with both regret and longing, but it was clear that he, too, was conflicted. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was deafening, and Grace felt a weight settle in her chest. She had always prided herself on being loyal, on being a devoted wife, but in that moment, she had betrayed everything she stood for. She had let herself slip into something she had never imagined. The man she had once seen as a spiritual guide had become something more, a temptation she hadn't been able to resist. Pastor James was the first to break the silence. He apologized, his voice strained with emotion. He told her that he never meant for things to go this far, that he was just as conflicted as she was. He urged her to pray about what had happened, to seek clarity from God, and to confront the choices she had made. But Grace couldn't hear him. The only thing she could hear was the pounding of her own heart, the guilt and shame that weighed heavily on her. She quickly stood, her hands trembling, and hurried to the door. Pastor James didn't stop her, but his gaze followed her as she left, his expression a mixture of sorrow and understanding. As Grace stepped into the cool night air, her mind raced. She felt like she had just stepped into a world she couldn't control, a world where her emotions were no longer hers alone to navigate. She had crossed a line, and there was no going back. But as she walked away from the church, there was a part of her that couldn't deny the truth. The kiss, the connection, had awakened something in her. It was as though she had been asleep for years, only to find herself suddenly alive again. And despite the guilt, despite the confusion, she couldn't ignore the pull she felt. It was a pull that threatened everything she had built with Jonathan, and yet, she couldn't seem to escape it. Grace had entered uncharted territory, and the consequences of her actions were still unfolding. The kiss had changed everything. The question now was whether she would find a way back to the life she once knew, or whether she would continue down this dangerous, emotional path with Pastor James. Grace could hardly focus on anything after that night. The kiss haunted her, replaying over and over in her mind, as she tried to come to terms with what she had done. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Pastor James' face, the intensity of his gaze, the tenderness of his touch. The weight of what had happened was suffocating, and it was beginning to affect everything around her. Her once orderly life now felt like it was unraveling. She found it hard to look Jonathan in the eye, unsure of how to act. Her marriage, once secure and predictable, now felt fragile and distant. She tried to continue with her daily routines, caring for the kids, handling household chores, but it was as if she was moving through life in a fog. Every moment felt like a reminder of the betrayal she had committed, even if no one else knew about it. She had kept her guilt hidden, but it was slowly eating away at her. She knew she had to confront her actions, but the weight of her emotional affair with Pastor James felt too heavy to acknowledge. She couldn't even begin to think about how to explain it to Jonathan, let alone face the truth of what it